Tariffs are usually sold to the public in a very simple way. The story goes like this. A country puts taxes on foreign goods. Foreign companies suffer. Domestic industry gets protected, and the home country gains leverage. It sounds clean. It sounds tough. It sounds like somebody else is paying the price. But the real answer is much more awkward than that. Because when you look closely at how tariffs actually work, a large part of the bill does not stay overseas. It comes back home. It gets absorbed by importers, by businesses, and eventually by consumers. And that is where the whole conversation starts to get uncomfortable. At first glance, the idea behind tariffs feels straightforward. If a government places a tariff on imported goods, it seems logical to assume that the foreign exporter will eat the cost in order to keep selling into that market. That is the message people often hear. We tax them, they pay. We get stronger, they get weaker. But trade does not work like a one-line slogan. International business is not a simple one-way punishment system. It is a chain of contracts, margins, pricing decisions, supply relationships, and strategic compromises. And once you understand that, the question of who actually pays gets a lot messier. The first thing to understand is what a tariff really is. A tariff is a tax applied when goods cross a border. It is not magically collected from a foreign government as punishment. It is usually paid by the importer bringing those goods into the country. That is the first reality people often miss. The importer, which is often a domestic company, gets hit with the higher cost right away. Now that importer has a problem. Do they absorb the cost themselves and accept lower profits? Do they pass some of it to retailers? Do retailers pass it to consumers? Do they renegotiate with suppliers? Do they switch suppliers? Do they redesign the product? Every one of those decisions matters. And that is why the simple claim that foreign exporters pay the tariff starts to break down. In reality, the burden gets split. Sometimes the foreign supplier will lower prices slightly to stay competitive. Sometimes they won't. Sometimes the importer will absorb some of the cost. Sometimes they can't afford to. And very often, at least part of the cost moves down the chain until it reaches the consumer. Not always in one big, obvious jump, but through small pricing changes, tighter margins, fewer discounts, weaker product quality, or higher final shelf prices. This is where the answer becomes awkward, because politically, tariffs are often framed as a tool that punishes outsiders. Economically, they often end up functioning like a tax inside your own system, a tax on companies that rely on imported components, a tax on businesses trying to manage costs, a tax on consumers who eventually buy the finished product. That doesn't mean tariffs never affect foreign exporters. Of course they do. But the idea that the pain stays neatly overseas is usually more myth than reality. To see why, imagine a U.S. company importing machine parts, electronics, textiles, or industrial inputs from abroad. Once the tariff hits, that company now has a higher landed cost. If margins were already thin, it may have no real choice except to raise prices. If it competes in a market where prices are hard to raise immediately, it may absorb the hit for a while, which means lower profits, less flexibility, and sometimes less hiring or investment. If it uses those imports to make a final product domestically, then that final product may become more expensive too. So even if the tariff is aimed at a foreign good, the shock can move through domestic production as well. And that's another uncomfortable part of the story. Tariffs do not only hit finished consumer goods, they often hit intermediate goods too. The parts, materials, components, and machinery used by domestic businesses. That means a policy sold as protecting local industry can sometimes raise costs for local industry at the exact same time. One domestic company may benefit from less foreign competition, while another domestic company pays more for imported inputs. So the winners and losers are rarely as simple as the political messaging suggests. This is why economists often focus on incidence, not just who is legally charged the tariff at the border, but who actually bears the economic burden after all the price adjustments work through the system. And that's where things get revealing. The formal payer at the border may be the importer, but the economic burden often gets shared in ways the public doesn't easily see. It can show up in higher prices, smaller margins, weaker competitiveness, reduced product variety, or slower business investment. The final burden can be spread widely, which makes it politically convenient to oversimplify. There's also a timing issue here. Tariffs don't always show up instantly in a way that makes them easy to connect to one cause. Companies may absorb costs for a while before raising prices. Retailers may delay. Some products may only partially reflect the tariff at first. In other cases, businesses may change packaging sizes, reduce discounts, or lower product quality instead of openly raising sticker prices. That makes it harder for consumers to notice the full pass-through, even when they're paying it indirectly. And then there's the question of bargaining power. Who absorbs the tariff often depends on who has more room to negotiate. A giant retailer with scale may pressure suppliers. A powerful brand may pass costs to customers more easily. A weak importer with little leverage may get squeezed hard. A foreign exporter desperate to keep market access may lower its price a bit, but not enough to offset the full tariff. So the burden is shaped by market structure, not just trade policy. This is why blanket statements about tariffs are so misleading. The answer is not that foreign exporters never pay anything. The answer is that they often don't pay all of it, and sometimes they pay much less than the public is led to believe. A meaningful share can stay inside the importing country. That means the domestic economy can end up taxing itself in the name of punishing someone else. And that's what makes the whole topic politically powerful, but economically awkward. Now, supporters of tariffs will argue that even if consumers or importers pay some of the cost, the tariffs can still be worth it. They might say the purpose is to protect strategic industries, rebuild manufacturing, reduce dependency, or gain leverage in negotiations. And that's a real argument. Sometimes governments are willing to accept higher costs in the short run for broader strategic goals. The problem is not that tariffs can never have a purpose. The problem is when people pretend they're free weapons, like a tool that hurts foreign producers while leaving domestic consumers untouched. That version of the story is usually far too clean.
There's also a big difference between the politics of tariffs and the economics of tariffs. Politically, tariffs are easy to sell because they feel direct and forceful. They create a visible enemy and a visible response. Economically, they are much more complicated. They filter through supply chains, pricing systems, and corporate strategies. They often create hidden costs rather than obvious ones. That makes them a powerful political symbol and a messy economic instrument. And one of the strangest parts of the debate is that tariffs can sometimes make inflation pressures worse. If they raise import costs and those costs get passed through, consumers may face higher prices. If domestic producers face less competition, they may also have more room to charge more. If input costs rise for local manufacturers, finished goods can become more expensive. So tariffs can create exactly the kind of price pressure that policymakers later struggle to contain. This is where the awkwardness becomes impossible to ignore. A policy marketed as protection can end up raising costs for the same people it claims to defend. Not always, not evenly, and not in every sector, but often enough that the simple story falls apart. Consumers pay more. Importers lose margin. Businesses face higher input costs. Some sectors gain protection, while others absorb pain. The burden gets spread through the domestic economy in ways that are easy to deny and hard to measure in everyday life. Another issue is that supply chains are not as easy to rearrange as political speeches make them sound. When tariffs go up, companies cannot always instantly find a perfect domestic substitute. Sometimes the needed supplier base does not exist. Sometimes switching takes years. Sometimes quality, scale, or price make domestic replacement unrealistic in the short term. So instead of seamlessly replacing foreign goods, companies often remain dependent on imports while simply paying them more. That means the tariff functions less like a clean strategic reset and more like a recurring domestic cost. There is also the possibility of retaliation. If one country imposes tariffs, another may answer with tariffs of its own. Then exporters in the tariff-imposing country may lose access or competitiveness abroad. So even if the original political story was about protecting domestic industry, some domestic sectors may end up getting hurt on the export side. That makes the overall picture even more tangled. Protection in one lane can create pain in another. And that is why the real answer to the question, who actually pays for tariffs, is so awkward. The official story suggests the burden falls mainly on foreign exporters. The fuller reality is that a substantial share often lands on domestic importers, domestic businesses, and domestic consumers. In other words, the tax crosses the border, but the pain does not stay there. It spreads through the importing country's own economy. In the end, tariffs are not magic. They are taxes with strategic intentions attached to them. Sometimes governments may decide those intentions are worth the cost, but the cost is still real. And if you ignore who is actually paying it, you end up treating a complex economic tool like a slogan. The awkward truth is that when tariffs rise, the bill often comes home.